In a small town in Oregon, a 32-year-old veteran sat alone in a VA clinic waiting room, one bad day away from losing everything. He had nowhere to go, no one waiting for him, and barely enough gas to make it through the week. But then he saw something everyone else had ignored. A German shepherd, sitting quietly in the corner, weathered and forgotten, with a military medal hanging from its collar. Helping the dog meant missing his only job opportunity that day, possibly losing the last bit of stability he had left. But he didn't hesitate. What he didn't know is that this wasn't just any K9, and the person looking for it would change his life forever. The afternoon had settled into that particular kind of gray that only autumn in Oregon could offer. Heavy clouds pressed low against the hills, and a damp chill worked its way through jackets no matter how tightly they were zipped. In the small town of Pinewood, where the main street stretched only 4 blocks and everyone knew everyone's business, the VA clinic sat at the far edge of town like an afterthought, tucked between a laundromat and an abandoned diner. Inside the waiting room, Marcus Reed sat with his shoulders hunched forward, elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped together as if holding something invisible that might slip away if he let go. He was 32, but the lines around his eyes made him look older. His jacket was military issue, faded and fraying at the cuffs, and his boots were scuffed beyond recognition, held together more by habit than leather. He had come for his monthly check-in, the kind of appointment that felt less like care and more like paperwork. A nurse would ask how he was sleeping. He would lie. A doctor would glance at his chart and renew his prescriptions. And then he'd leave, back to his truck parked behind the Walmart 3 miles down the road, where he'd been sleeping for the past 2 weeks since his lease ran out and his savings finally hit zero. Marcus checked his phone. 3:47 p.m. He had exactly 1 hour before he was supposed to meet Billy at the hardware store for a possible day of work, moving stock, cleaning out the back shed, anything that paid cash under the table. Billy had been good to him, offering shifts here and there when he could, but even that was drying up. If Marcus missed this one, he wasn't sure there'd be another. The waiting room was nearly empty. A middle-aged woman flipped through a magazine without reading it. An older man dozed in the corner, his veteran's cap tilted low over his face. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, flickering occasionally, casting everything in a sickly yellow glow. And then Marcus saw the dog. It sat near the far wall, just beyond the vending machines, partially hidden by a row of plastic chairs. A German shepherd, older, its dark coat dulled with age and streaked with gray around the muzzle. It wasn't moving, wasn't pacing or whining or doing any of the things dogs usually did when they were anxious or lost. It just sat there, perfectly still, its ears slightly back, watching the room with quiet, intelligent eyes. No one seemed to notice it. People walked past without a glance. The receptionist called names from behind the desk. A janitor pushed a mop bucket down the hall. But the dog remained, as if it had been there for hours, waiting for someone who never came. Marcus tilted his head, his gaze narrowing. Something about the dog felt wrong. Not dangerous, just out of place. He stood slowly, his knees stiff from sitting too long, and walked toward it. As he got closer, the dog's eyes tracked him, but it didn't stand. Didn't growl or back away. It simply watched, measuring him the way soldiers measured each other in the field, cautious, but not afraid. And that's when Marcus saw it. Hanging from the dog's collar, partially obscured by matted fur, was a small bronze medal. Worn, scratched, but unmistakable. A military service medal. Marcus crouched down slowly, his heart beginning to beat a little faster. The dog's ears twitched forward just slightly, and for the first time its tail gave the faintest wag. "Hey there, buddy," Marcus whispered. "Where'd you come from?" The dog didn't answer, but Marcus didn't need it to, because in that moment, looking into those steady, weathered eyes, he recognized something he hadn't seen in a long time. A fellow soldier, lost, alone, and waiting for someone to finally see him. Marcus stayed crouched in front of the dog for a long moment, his hand hovering just above its head, waiting for permission. The German shepherd's eyes didn't leave his face. There was something deeply familiar in that gaze, calm, disciplined, but carrying the weight of too many hours spent on alert, too many nights without rest. Slowly, carefully, Marcus reached forward and let his fingers brush against the dog's fur. It was coarse, dirty, matted in places where no one had brushed it in weeks. But the dog leaned into his touch just slightly and released a long, tired breath. "You've been out here a while, haven't you?" Marcus murmured. He gently lifted the metal hanging from the collar, turning it over in his palm. The engraving was worn, but still legible. Asterisk, asterisk. Sergeant, MWD, K9 Corps, for valor and service, asterisk, asterisk. Beneath it, partially scratched away, was a registration number and a name he could barely make out. This wasn't some stray. This was a military working dog, a retired one by the look of him, and someone had either lost him or, worse, left him behind. Marcus's jaw tightened. He knew that feeling too well. "Marcus Reed?" The nurse's voice cut through the quiet waiting room like a bell. Marcus glanced up. The nurse stood in the doorway, clipboard in hand, scanning the room with mild impatience. His appointment, the one he'd been waiting 40 minutes for. He looked back down at the dog. Sergeant. That's what the medal said. The dog's eyes were still on him, steady and trusting in a way that made Marcus's chest ache. "Marcus Reed?" the nurse called again, louder this time. Marcus rose slowly to his feet, the dog's ears flattened slightly, as if sensing he was about to be left behind again. Marcus hesitated, torn. He needed this appointment, needed the prescriptions refilled, needed the paper trail that kept his veterans' benefits from getting tangled up in red tape. But then he thought about Billy, about the job, about the 1 hour he had left to make it across town before the opportunity disappeared. And he thought about this dog, sitting here in the corner, invisible to everyone who passed, waiting, hoping. Marcus turned toward the nurse and raised his hand. "I need to reschedule," he said. The nurse frowned. "You've already rescheduled twice this month." "I know, I'm sorry. Something came up." She sighed, made a note on her clipboard, and disappeared back through the door without another word. Marcus exhaled and looked back down at the dog. "All right, Sergeant," he said quietly. "Let's figure out where you belong." He checked the collar more carefully this time, running his fingers along the worn leather, searching for a tag, a phone number, an address. Anything. There was nothing. Just the metal and a faint imprint on the inside of the collar, barely visible. Asterisk, asterisk. D. Mitchell, 62, Ridgeline Ard, Cascade Hills, asterisk, asterisk. Marcus pulled out his phone and typed the address into his Maps app. His stomach sank. Cascade Hills. Nearly 90 minutes away, up winding mountain roads on the far side of the county. It was already past 4. If he left now, he'd never make it to Billy's in time. And even if he did make it back, there was no guarantee Billy would still be there. No guarantee there'd be work tomorrow or the day after. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. The smart thing to do was to call animal control. Let them handle it. They'd find the owner, they'd get the dog home. But Marcus had seen the way those systems worked, seen how things got lost in the cracks, how paperwork piled up, how a dog like this, old, tired, inconvenient, might get shuffled to the back of the line. Or worse. He looked into Sergeant's eyes one more time, and he made his choice. "Come on, buddy," Marcus said, his voice rough but certain. "Let's get you home." He stood and started toward the door. The dog hesitated for only a heartbeat, then rose to his feet and followed, his gait a little stiff, his tail low but steady. Marcus pushed open the clinic door and stepped out into the cold. Behind him, the waiting room returned to its quiet hum. No one noticed the veteran and the dog leaving together. No one ever did. Marcus's truck sat in the corner of the clinic parking lot, a faded blue Chevy with rust creeping up the wheel wells and a cracked windshield that spiderwebbed across the passenger side. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. His shelter, his storage, his last tether to anything resembling independence. He opened the passenger door and gestured inside. "Up you go." Sergeant hesitated, eyeing the worn bench seat with uncertainty. Marcus could see the stiffness in the dog's hind legs, the way he shifted his weight like every movement cost him something. "I know," Marcus said softly. Getting old's not easy, is it? He placed a hand gently under Sargent's chest and helped lift him into the cab. The dog settled onto the seat with a low groan, then turned his head toward Marcus as if to say thank you. Marcus climbed in on the driver's side, started the engine. It sputtered twice before catching, and pulled out onto the road. The tank was just above empty. He had maybe half a gallon left, enough to get to Cascade Hills if he didn't hit traffic. Getting back would be another problem. But he'd figure that out later. The road out of Pinewood was narrow and winding, lined with Douglas firs that leaned in close like they were trying to listen. The sky had darkened further, threatening rain, and the first few drops began to speckle the windshield as Marcus turned onto Highway 26 heading east into the hills. Sargent sat upright in the passenger seat, his ears forward, his eyes scanning the road ahead with the quiet focus of someone who'd spent years on patrol. Every now and then, he'd glance over at Marcus, as if checking to make sure he was still there. "You miss it, don't you?" Marcus said, his voice barely audible over the rumble of the engine. "The work, the purpose. Bet you were good at it too." The dog's tail thumped once against the seat. Marcus smiled faintly. It was the first real smile he'd felt in weeks. They drove in silence for a while, the road climbing steadily as the trees thickened and the air grew colder. The heater in the truck barely worked, so Marcus cranked it as high as it would go, but all it did was blow lukewarm air that smelled faintly of oil. About 40 minutes in, Marcus pulled into a gas station, a lonely little place with 2 pumps and a flickering neon sign that read, Earl's. He dug into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled $10 bill. It was all he had left until Billy paid him. If Billy paid him. He filled the tank with $7 worth of gas, then went inside and bought a bottle of water and a gas station hot dog that had been sitting under the heat lamp far too long. Back in the truck, he tore the hot dog in half and offered the larger piece to Sargent. The dog sniffed it cautiously, then took it gently from Marcus's hand, chewing slowly, deliberately, like he hadn't eaten in days. "When's the last time someone fed you, huh?" Marcus asked, watching him. Sargent finished the hot dog and licked his chops, then rested his head on Marcus's arm for just a moment, a silent gesture of trust that hit Marcus harder than he expected. He cleared his throat and started the truck again. The final stretch to Cascade Hills was the hardest. The road narrowed into switchbacks that climbed steeply through dense forest, and the rain came down harder now, drumming against the roof of the cab. Marcus's hands gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles white, his mind wandering to places he tried not to go. Memories of convoys, of winding roads in distant deserts, of friends who didn't make it home. Sargent seemed to sense it. He shifted closer, pressing his shoulder against Marcus's side, grounding him. "I'm all right," Marcus said quietly, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to the dog or himself. By the time they reached Ridgeline Road, the sun had started its descent behind the hills, casting everything in shades of deep blue and gray. The houses here were large, set back from the road behind gates and manicured lawns. Marcus felt out of place, like he'd crossed into a world that didn't belong to him. He slowed as the numbers climbed, 58, 60, and finally stopped in front of a grand 2-story home with white columns and a circular driveway. Number 62. Marcus killed the engine and looked over at Sargent. "This it, buddy?" The dog's ears perked up. His tail wagged just once, but with certainty. Marcus took a breath, stepped out into the rain, and walked around to open the passenger door. Together, they approached the front porch. Marcus knocked twice, his heart beating louder than it should have been. And then the door opened. The man who answered the door was tall and thin, dressed in a pressed button-down shirt and slacks, his silver hair neatly combed. He looked at Marcus first with polite confusion, then down at the dog, and his entire expression changed. "Sargent," he breathed, his voice cracking with relief. The dog's tail began to wag in earnest now, his whole body shifting forward with recognition. The man dropped to one knee, ignoring the rain, and wrapped his arms around the dog's neck, burying his face in the wet fur. "Oh, thank God," he whispered. "Thank God you're all right." Marcus stood back, hands in his pockets, suddenly feeling like an intruder on something private. After a moment, the man looked up, his eyes red-rimmed but grateful. "I'm James," he said, his voice steadying. I'm Mrs. Mitchell's caretaker. We've been looking for him for 2 days. He slipped out through the back gate during a walk. We didn't even realize until he was gone." He stood, one hand still resting on Sargent's head. "How did you find him?" "He was at the VA clinic in Pinewood," Marcus said. "Just sitting there. No one seemed to notice him." James shook his head, his jaw tight with frustration. "He must have walked miles. He used to be stationed near there years ago, before he retired. Must have been trying to find his way back to something familiar." Marcus nodded slowly. That made sense. Dogs remembered, especially the ones trained like Sargent. "Please," James said, stepping aside. "Come in. Warm yourself. Let me get Mrs. Mitchell. She'll want to thank you." Marcus hesitated. "That's all right. I should get going." "Please," James insisted, his tone gentle but firm. "It's the least we can do. You've driven all this way." Before Marcus could refuse again, an elderly woman appeared in the hallway behind James, leaning on a wooden cane. She was small, her white hair pinned neatly back, her eyes sharp despite her age. When she saw Sargent, her face crumpled with emotion. "My boy," she whispered. Sargent moved toward her immediately, his tail wagging, and she reached down with a trembling hand to touch his head. "Mrs. Mitchell," James said softly. "This young man brought him home." She looked up at Marcus, and for a long moment, she just studied him. Not with suspicion, but with the kind of careful attention that felt like being seen for the first time in years. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet but full of weight. "He's all I have left of my husband. He served with him overseas. I don't know what I would have done if—" She trailed off, her hand still resting on Sargent's head. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "I'm just glad he's safe." "Stay," she said. "Please. Have something to eat. Let us give you a ride back to town." Marcus shook his head. "I appreciate it, but I really need to get going." James pulled a business card from his pocket and handed it to Marcus. "At least take this, in case you ever need anything. Mrs. Mitchell would want you to have it." Marcus took the card, slipping it into his jacket without looking at it. He nodded once to Mrs. Mitchell, then turned and walked back to his truck, the rain soaking through his clothes. He didn't look back. By the time Marcus made it back to Pinewood, it was nearly 8 o'clock. The gas gauge hovered just above empty, the engine sputtering as he coasted into the Walmart parking lot where he'd been sleeping. But when he pulled into his usual spot near the back fence, his heart sank. There was a notice taped to the fence post, ***, no overnight parking. Vehicles will be towed. ***. Marcus stared at it, his hand still gripping the wheel. He'd been parking here for 2 weeks without issue. But now, like everything else, that grace had run out. He drove slowly through town, looking for another place to park, somewhere quiet, somewhere he wouldn't be noticed. But Pinewood was small, and every lot had cameras, every street had rules. Finally, he pulled into the alley behind Billy's Hardware, where the dumpsters sat, and the streetlights didn't quite reach. He turned off the engine and sat in the silence, the cold already creeping into the cab. He'd missed the job, missed the chance to make enough for gas, for food, for another week of scraping by. His phone buzzed, a text from Billy. ***, where were you? Had to find someone else." "Sorry, man." Marcus set the phone down and leaned his head back against the seat. He thought about Sargent, about the way the dog had leaned into him, about Mrs. Mitchell's face when she saw him safe. And for reasons he couldn't quite explain, Marcus didn't feel as empty as he thought he would. He pulled the thin blanket from the back seat, wrapped it around his shoulders, and closed his eyes. Tomorrow would come. It always did. The morning came slowly, reluctant and gray, the kind of dawn that felt more like a continuation of night than the start of something new. Marcus woke to the sound of a truck backing up somewhere down the alley, its warning beep cutting through the thin walls of his dreams and dragging him back to the cold reality of the cab. His neck was stiff, his back aching from the awkward angle he'd slept in. Frost had gathered on the inside of the windshield, delicate patterns of ice that melted slowly under the warmth of his breath as he sat up and rubbed his hands together. He checked his phone. 7:14. M. 3 missed calls from a number he didn't recognize. No voicemail. Marcus ignored them and climbed out of the truck, his joints protesting with every movement. The alley smelled of dumpster runoff and wet cardboard. He stretched, walked to the edge of the street, and stood there for a moment, watching the town begin to wake. A few cars passed, a jogger in reflective gear. The coffee shop across the street turned on its lights. He thought about going in, spending his last few dollars on something warm, but before he could decide, a sleek black sedan pulled up to the curb in front of him. Marcus tensed instinctively, his hand moving toward his pocket out of habit, though there was nothing there to protect himself with. The driver's side door opened and James stepped out, dressed in a long gray coat, his expression calm but purposeful. He looked directly at Marcus, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "Mr. Reed," James said finally, his voice carrying easily across the quiet street. Marcus blinked. "How do you know my name?" James offered a small, knowing smile. "You left your VA appointment card on the seat of your truck yesterday. It was on the floor when Sergeant got out." Marcus frowned, patting his pockets, realizing it was true. "Mrs. Mitchell sent me to find you," James continued. "She'd like to speak with you, if you're willing." Marcus shook his head slowly. "I told you yesterday. I don't need anything. I just wanted to make sure the dog got home." "I know," James said. "And that's exactly why she wants to see you." There was something in his tone, not insistence, but a quiet certainty, that made Marcus hesitate. He glanced back at his truck, then at the alley behind him, then at the street ahead where he had nowhere to go and nothing waiting for him. "It won't take long," James added. "And there's breakfast." Marcus's stomach tightened at the mention of food. He hadn't eaten since the gas station hot dog he'd split with Sergeant. "All right," he said finally, "but just to talk." James nodded and opened the passenger door. The drive back to Cascade Hills felt different in daylight. The rain had cleared and the trees stood tall and still against a pale blue sky. Marcus sat quietly in the passenger seat, his hands folded in his lap, his mind turning over a dozen reasons why this was a bad idea. When they arrived at the house, James led him not to the front door, but around the side, through a garden gate, and into a sunlit conservatory filled with plants and wicker furniture. It smelled of earth and lavender. Mrs. Mitchell was already there, seated in a high-backed chair with Sergeant lying at her feet. When she saw Marcus, her face softened and she gestured to the chair across from her. "Please," she said, "sit." Marcus did, slowly, his eyes drifting to Sergeant, who lifted his head and thumped his tail once in greeting. Mrs. Mitchell watched him carefully, her hands folded over the top of her cane. "I didn't sleep last night," she said. "I kept thinking about you." Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "You don't need to." "Let me finish," she said gently, but with the kind of authority that came from a lifetime of being listened to. "James told me you drove an hour and a half in the rain to bring Sergeant home, that you refused any thanks, that you left before we could even offer you a meal." She paused, her gaze steady. "And then I made some calls. I have friends at the VA. I know you missed your appointment yesterday. I know you've been living out of your truck. And I know you gave up work to help a dog you didn't even know." Marcus's jaw tightened. He didn't like being looked into, didn't like being known. "I'm not here to embarrass you," Mrs. Mitchell continued. "I'm here to thank you, and to offer you something." She reached beside her chair and pulled out a folded piece of paper, handwritten in careful script. "My husband was a colonel," she said quietly. "He served 3 tours. Sergeant served with him on the last one. When my husband passed 2 years ago, Sergeant stayed with me. He's the last piece of him I have left." Her voice wavered, but she steadied herself. "You didn't just bring my dog home, Mr. Reed. You brought back something I thought I'd lost." She held out the paper. "This is an offer, not charity. A job, if you'll take it." Marcus stared at the paper but didn't reach for it. "What kind of job?" Mrs. Mitchell smiled faintly. "The kind where you help me take care of this old house and this old dog, and maybe in the process find a place to rest." Marcus stared at the paper in Mrs. Mitchell's outstretched hand, but he didn't take it. His throat felt tight, his chest heavy with something he couldn't quite name, gratitude maybe, or suspicion, or the kind of disbelief that comes from years of expecting disappointment. "I appreciate the offer," he said carefully, his voice low. "But I didn't do this for a reward. I just wanted to make sure Sargent got home safe, that's all." Mrs. Mitchell didn't lower her hand. She simply watched him, her expression patient, as if she'd expected this exact response. "I know you didn't," she said softly, "and that's precisely why I'm offering." Marcus looked away, his jaw working. He could feel Sargent's eyes on him, steady and calm, like the dog understood something Marcus didn't. "I don't need anyone's pity," Marcus said, the words coming out sharper than he intended. "This isn't pity," Mrs. Mitchell replied, her tone firm but kind. "This is recognition. There's a difference." She set the paper down on the small table between them, smoothing it with her weathered hands. "I've lived long enough to know that character isn't built in moments of convenience," she continued. "It's built in moments like yesterday, when you had every reason to walk away and you didn't." Marcus shook his head. "Anyone would have done the same." "But they didn't," she said simply. "You did." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the faint sound of wind rustling through the conservatory's glass panels. Marcus felt the weight of her words pressing against something fragile inside him, something he'd been holding together with sheer stubbornness for too long. "I'm not asking you to accept out of obligation," Mrs. Mitchell said, her voice softer now. "I'm asking because I need help. This house is too big for me and James to manage alone. Sargent needs someone who understands him. And frankly, Mr. Reed, you look like you could use a place to land." Marcus met her eyes then, and for the first time he saw not pity, but something deeper, understanding, the kind that only came from someone who'd walked through their own fire and come out the other side. "Think about it," she said, rising slowly from her chair, leaning on her cane for support. "I'm not going anywhere. Neither is Sargent." She turned and walked toward the door, then paused and looked back. "The offer stands, Mr. Reed, whenever you're ready." And then she was gone, leaving Marcus alone in the conservatory with Sargent and the folded piece of paper on the table. Marcus stayed in that chair for a long time after she left, staring at the paper without touching it. His mind raced through 100 reasons to say no. Pride, fear, the belief that he didn't deserve it, the certainty that it wouldn't last. But beneath all of that was something quieter, something he'd been ignoring for months. Exhaustion. He was so tired of running, tired of waking up cold, tired of pretending he didn't need help, tired of carrying everything alone. Sargent shifted at his feet, then stood and walked over, resting his head on Marcus's knee. The dog's eyes were deep and knowing, and when Marcus reached down to scratch behind his ears, Sargent leaned into the touch with a soft sigh. "What do you think, buddy?" Marcus whispered. "You trust her?" Sargent's tail wagged once, slow and deliberate. Marcus exhaled, long and shaky, and finally reached for the paper. 2 days later, Marcus returned. He didn't call ahead, didn't make a big announcement. He just drove up the long driveway in his sputtering truck, parked near the side entrance, and knocked on the door. James answered, his expression shifting from surprise to quiet approval. "She's in the garden," James said, stepping aside. Marcus found her there, kneeling beside a bed of late-season roses, Sargent lying in the grass nearby. When she heard his footsteps, she looked up and a slow smile spread across her face. "Mr. Reed," she said, brushing the dirt from her gloves, "I was hoping you'd come back." Marcus nodded, his hands in his pockets, his heart beating harder than it should have been. "I've been thinking about your offer," he said, "and if it's still open, I'd like to accept." Mrs. Mitchell rose to her feet, steadying herself with her cane, and extended her hand. "Welcome home, Marcus." He took her hand, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he didn't feel like he was falling. He felt like he'd landed. That evening, James showed Marcus to a small cottage at the back of the property. Simple, clean, with a bed, a desk, and a window that overlooked the hills. It wasn't much, but it was more than Marcus had seen in years. Sargent followed him inside, circled the room once, then curled up on a rug by the door, as if he'd been waiting for this moment all along. Marcus sat on the edge of the bed, looked around the room, and let himself breathe. For the first time in a long time, he was home. The first few weeks at the Mitchell estate passed quietly, almost carefully, as if Marcus and Mrs. Mitchell were both learning the rhythm of each other's presence. Marcus kept his head down and worked steadily, repairing fence posts, clearing overgrown brush from the garden paths, fixing the loose shingles on the cottage roof. He didn't ask for much, and he didn't expect anything beyond what had been offered. But Mrs. Mitchell had other plans. She began joining him in the mornings, walking slowly through the garden with Sargent at her side, asking Marcus about his time in the service, about the men he'd served with, about the things he'd seen and the things he didn't talk about. She didn't push. She simply listened, the way someone does when they've carried their own weight and understand the value of silence. And in those quiet conversations, something began to shift. Marcus learned that Mrs. Mitchell's husband, Colonel Raymond Mitchell, had spent 30 years in the Army, most of it deployed overseas. He'd adopted Sargent during his final tour in Afghanistan, after the dog had been injured in an IED explosion and retired from active duty. The colonel brought him home, and together they'd spent his last 2 years walking these same garden paths, finding peace in the stillness after so much chaos. He used to say that Sargent saved his life more than once, Mrs. Mitchell said one morning, her voice soft with memory. Not just in the field, but after, when the nightmares came, when the world felt too loud. Marcus nodded, his hand resting on Sargent's head. He understood. I think that's why I couldn't let him go, she continued. Losing Raymond was hard enough. Losing Sargent would have felt like losing him twice. She looked at Marcus then, her eyes clear and steady. But I'm not young anymore. And Sargent isn't either. We both need someone who understands what it's like to carry something heavy and keep moving forward anyway. Marcus swallowed hard, unsure what to say. You've given us that, she said simply. And I'd like to give you something in return. Over the following months, Mrs. Mitchell began involving Marcus in more than just the upkeep of the estate. She introduced him to her late husband's foundation, a small nonprofit that had been dormant since the colonel's passing, originally created to support veterans transitioning back to civilian life. I never had the energy to run it alone, she admitted one evening over tea. But with your help, I think we could bring it back. Marcus hesitated. I'm not sure I'm the right person for that. You're exactly the right person, she said firmly. You know what it's like. You've lived it. And so, slowly, they began. They renamed it ****, the Sargent's Path Foundation, ***, in honor of the dog who had brought them together and the colonel who had understood that healing didn't happen in isolation. It happened in purpose. The mission was simple: to provide housing support, job training, and companionship programs, pairing veterans with retired service dogs who needed homes. Marcus took on the role reluctantly at first, but as the weeks turned into months, he found himself drawn deeper into the work. He met with other veterans, listened to their stories, helped them navigate the systems that had failed him so many times, and in doing so, he began to heal parts of himself he didn't realize were still broken. Mrs. Mitchell watched it all with quiet pride, her energy renewed by the sense of purpose that had returned to the estate. Sargent, too, seemed revitalized, his tail wagging more often, his eyes brighter, as if he understood that his work wasn't finished yet. Together, the three of them built something that mattered. One crisp autumn afternoon, nearly a year after Marcus had first knocked on Mrs. Mitchell's door, he found himself driving back through Pinewood. He had errands to run, picking up supplies for the foundation's new office space downtown, but as he passed the VA clinic, he slowed. The parking lot looked the same. The building hadn't changed, but Marcus had. He pulled into the lot and parked near the entrance, then sat for a moment staring at the spot where he'd first seen Sargent, sitting alone in the corner, invisible to everyone who passed. He thought about the choice he'd made that day, about how close he'd come to walking away, about how one decision, one moment of noticing, had changed everything. Sargent sat in the passenger seat beside him now, his graying muzzle resting on the console, his eyes calm and knowing. You did good, buddy, Marcus said, scratching behind the dog's ears. You led me home. Sargent's tail thumped once against the seat. Marcus smiled, started the engine, and pulled back onto the road. But before he left, he glanced once more at the clinic entrance, at the corner where it had all began, and he made himself a quiet promise. He would never stop noticing, never stop showing up, Never stop offering a hand to someone the world had overlooked. Because sometimes all it takes to change a life is the willingness to see someone or something that everyone else has ignored. And sometimes the one being saved isn't the one you expect. Asterisk, asterisk. Join us in honoring the heroes who serve, both human and K9, by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Turn on notifications to start your day with stories of courage, loyalty, and the unbreakable bonds forged in service. Asterisk, asterisk.